happens. I think another good example is in medicine. Again, in the early 1930s, actually late 1930s, the first synthetic estrogen was created called diethylstilbestrol. And many of you have heard of diethylstilbestrol, or DES. And what happened was very interesting. What happened was doctors, and I'm sure the pharmaceutical company also got involved, but doctors were looking at women who had miscarriages. And they said, well, this is a very disheartening thing. This is traumatic for people to think they're going to have children and then suddenly lose the baby. And they did studies, and they looked at the urine of the women who were pregnant, and they found that about a week before the women had a miscarriage, those who had miscarriages, their estrogen levels in their urine would drop. So they had this new synthetic estrogen. They say, hey, what a great idea. We'll give estrogen, and then we may be able to prevent miscarriages. Now, that's a reasonable thing to think, but I think you need some proof before you start putting a chemical, which is unproven, unknown, into the bodies of human beings. But they did that nonetheless. And everybody started, not everybody, but millions, literally millions of doctors started giving, millions of patients, of thousands of doctors, started giving DES to women who were pregnant to prevent pregnancies. And they did this for quite some time, up until about the early 1950s. In the early 1950s, somebody did a study, and they did a great study. They looked at this, and they said, well, doesn't this, in fact, help? Do we stop miscarriages by giving DES? Turns out that it didn't. They did a study, and it showed that the rate of miscarriage in people who got DES and the rate of miscarriages in people who didn't get DES was identical. It didn't do anything to help these women. Now, you would think that doctors at that point in time would say, well, okay, it doesn't work. Let's stop doing this. No. What doctors did is what everyone does. They said, well, yeah, I know what the studies show, but in my experience, I know Mrs. Jones who had, 4 miscarriages, and I gave DES, and this time she had that lovely baby. I know it works. No, what you know is, if in fact that's true to begin with, is that Mrs. Jones was one of the outliers, and there are always outliers. And yes, this one was one person who had 4 miscarriages and didn't miscarry on the 5th time. That happens in some certain circumstances. But when you do the study, it turns out that you don't get that finding is incorrect, that what you're seeing is something very skewed. You're seeing one example, and you're applying that, extrapolating for a major population. And in fact, that extrapolation is wrong. And so what happened? Well, the doctors did like this doctor did, and said, well, I know what the studies show, but I know in reality, and kept giving this medication. Incredibly, even though we knew that it didn't do any good, according to the studies. And then, very interestingly, those people who did the studies decided to follow further and look at the babies who were born to the mothers who took DES. A very wise thing, a very prescient idea for them to go look at that. And they found out that the female babies, and actually the males too, but the daughters of those women who had taken DES to prevent miscarriages, when they now got to be in their reproductive years, they were having some complications. They had an increased number of miscarriages, they had ectopic pregnancies, they had a thing called clear cell carcinoma, a cancer. They had a number of abnormalities of development, and they had a bunch of problems. And it turned out this cancer killed a number of those people. Probably a couple hundred people died. So at that point, doctors stopped using this to prevent miscarriages. They stopped using DES because they realized that, in fact, not only didn't it help, but it was harming people. We killed people as a result of this idea that wasn't tested, and these doctors who continued to assume that what they were doing was correct because they had some anecdotal evidence. And that's what you have to be careful. You have to go to the source. You have to do the study, essentially. So if there's a historical issue, you have to go back and look at it. If there's a experimental issue, you have to do the study to find out whether or not it's correct. And it's very important that you do this, because otherwise you have significant harms. So that's why we, as atheists, or I at least, don't believe in God, because I haven't seen that study. I haven't gotten the source that says here. All right, people say, well, there's the Bible. Yeah, but I don't know if that's any better source than the information we have about George Washington, or about DES, or about this man who had cancer in Miami, Florida. You have to get to the original data and be sure that that's correct. And, people say, well, we all believe in this stuff, because they see other people doing that. It doesn't get you there. John Leland in 1791 said it very carefully in terms of the government. He said that truth disdains the aid of law for its defense. It will stand upon its own merits. It is error, and error alone, which needs human support. The idea being that when people all gather together and say, yeah, this is a truth, but it's only because they all keep saying it, that's a very dangerous issue, as we saw by people dying from DES and all the other harms that come from people not understanding the truth, not getting the truth, and assuming that something that they've heard is correct. So I'm going to let it end there. I just want you to understand that basically the idea is you got to make sure that your information is correct, and that'll help you to enjoy life. It'll help us all to progress and proceed. Even if the answers that we find are not quite the ones that we want to hear, that will help us to get to the place we want to get by having the truth to work on. It's very important. And again, do the study. So we're going to have some conversations on this. We're going to have some free thing, drink, spend some more time, sing some songs. And we're going to end up this sermon, as we always do, with a song. This one we're going to do the study. Thank you.
It's clear that an answer is there.
It's coming.
So don't you waste time on despair.
It's coming.
Rely on your brain. Maybe there will be some strain, but you'll obtain your dreams if you just obtain your dreams if you just. You'll obtain your dreams if you just dare.